Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely night, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the Black Death, that great pestilence which swept across Europe in the 14th century, changing forever the lives of kings and peasants alike. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honor, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. I still recall the whispers that reached our ears in the year of 1347, when the first dark tidings came from the southern seas. Genoese ships had returned from the Crimea, their sails heavy with more than cargo. In the harbours of Messina, Sicily, men staggered ashore, pale and trembling, their bodies marked with swellings that seemed to bloom overnight. Some claimed the very rats that ran along the ropes carried death in their fur, their fleas unseen but merciless. The air itself seemed to sour, as if the sea had breathed out sickness upon the land. The ports were the lifeblood of Europe, open doors through which spices, silks, and knowledge flowed. Yet with that flow came something unseen, and far more terrible. In Genoa and Pisa, merchants who once bargained for cloth now gasped for breath, their flesh darkening as though fire licked beneath their skin. The marketplace, once filled with laughter and quarrels, grew silent under the shadow of the pestilence. What had been bustling towns became quiet places of dread, where every cough was feared as a herald of doom. Travellers brought more than goods. They carried fate upon their skin. A single ship could spread affliction to an entire city, and no prayer nor offering seemed to bar its way. In Marseille and Venice, the same grim tale repeated itself. Bustling quays silenced within weeks, priests overwhelmed, and burials hurried. The rhythm of life that had pulsed with the tides was broken, replaced with panic that spread faster than sails before the wind. Europe had opened its gates, and death entered freely. Those of us who rode the roads saw the signs before we heard the cries. Inns shuttered their doors to strangers, and villages placed guards at their borders. Yet still, the sickness moved inland, carried by merchants who sought to outrun it, and by pilgrims who prayed to escape it. Fleas hidden in bundles of cloth found their way into homes, gnawing at the very heart of households. Wherever commerce had flourished, the pestilence now followed, undoing centuries of toil in a matter of months. Chroniclers of the time wrote with trembling hands. In Sicily, one friar described whole families perishing within days, their neighbours too fearful to tend them. Bodies lay in the streets until carts could bear them to hastily dug pits. Even the scribes seemed to lose heart, their words fading into silence as if ink itself could not capture the scale of despair. What entered Europe was not merely a sickness, but a tide that swept away memory and order alike. To those alive then, it seemed sudden, yet history shows its approach was steady. Carried across the seas from the east, borne by fleas that clung unseen, the plague had chosen Europe as its next great stage. It is strange to think that something so small, hidden in the fur of vermin, could unravel empires and topple the proudest cities. But such is the truth, and men learned too late that no wall nor fortress can guard against what the eye cannot see. The shock was not only in death, but in its pace. A man who felt well at dawn could be in his grave by nightfall. This swiftness struck terror into hearts already worn thin by famine and hardship. The fear of tomorrow vanished, for tomorrow itself became uncertain. Life shrank into the present hour, where even the embrace of kin was tainted by suspicion. Few dared linger by the sickbed, for love itself could become a noose. So it was that the Black Death made its entrance upon our continent, not with the roar of armies or the thunder of siege, but with the creak of ship timbers and the scratching of tiny claws in the dark. By the time we understood what had come ashore, it had already spread beyond reach. and thus began the unmaking of a world that thought itself secure, a lesson carved into our bones that still lingers in memory. Long before the pestilence reached the shores of Europe, it had already sown ruin in the heart of Asia. Among the high ridges of the Tian Shan Mountains, where nomads grazed their herds and caravans threaded their way across ancient paths, the plague had its first home. There, Yersinia pestis moved quietly among rodents that scurried beneath the earth, unnoticed by kings or scholars. It was not conquest nor treaty that carried it westward, but the restless tides of trade that bound distant lands together. The Silk Road, that great artery of commerce, became a corridor for death. Merchants carried jade, spices, and silk, but hidden in their packs came fleas eager for new hosts. Each step westward was marked not by triumph, but by an unseen shadow that clung to every wagon and saddlebag. What once united empires in wealth and exchange now served as a bridge for ruin. The same routes that brought prosperity to towns like Samarkand and Bukhara became the channels through which misery travelled. In the chronicles of the East, there are notes of sudden silences, villages abandoned, markets left barren. Mongol soldiers, fierce in battle, could not raise their swords against a foe they could not perceive. As their armies stretched across continents, so too did the sickness find new fields. For some, it seemed the hand of heaven had turned against them, striking down warriors and herds alike. The steppe, once echoing with hooves and cries, fell quiet under the weight of invisible enemies. Ibn al-Wardi, a Syrian writer, spoke of how the pestilence had first struck the land of darkness, before moving toward India, then Persia, and beyond. His words captured the sense of a scourge that respected no border nor creed. From the east, wave after wave pressed westward, borne by the unceasing flow of caravans. What had begun in the quiet burrows of rodents was now a force that stretched across civilizations, altering the fate of kingdoms far removed from its birthplace. The Mongol Empire, vast and interconnected, unwittingly hastened the spread. Their Pax Mongolica had tied lands together with strong roads and protected caravans, ensuring that goods flowed without interruption. Yet in that same web, the disease moved swifter than any horseman. A unity forged by conquest became the very net in which death ensnared millions. What had once been the glory of the Great Khan's dominion became the stage of unparalleled tragedy. Even before Europe heard whispers, the East had endured immense loss. Entire towns in China and Central Asia were reported to have vanished, their people gone as if swallowed by the earth. Grain rotted in fields, temples stood deserted, and families were erased from memory. The pestilence did not strike as a single storm, but as a ceaseless wind, reshaping the lives of all who dwelt under its path. Such devastation in distant lands was but the prelude to the sorrow that awaited the West. To understand the Black Death in Europe, one must look first to the mountains and plains where it was born. There, the disease learned its path, testing itself upon communities bound to earth and herd. From that cradle of affliction, it moved outward, carried by necessity, curiosity, and greed. The Silk Road bore not only treasures, but burdens, and Europe would soon inherit them in full measure. Thus, the origins of the plague remind us that no land is ever truly apart. What happens in one valley, one steppe, or one market may ripple outward, carried on the backs of merchants and the hooves of horses. So it was in Asia, where a silent enemy first stirred, destined to alter the fate of continents. In tracing its roots, we see not only the frailty of life, but the threads that bind all men together across distance and time. On the shores of the Black Sea, the fortress city of Kaffa stood as a prized Genoese outpost, a hub of commerce and a meeting place of East and West. In the year 1346, its high stone walls were tested not only by the strength of Mongol arms, but by something far more sinister. The besieging army of the Golden Horde, encamped outside its gates, was struck by a sudden and mysterious sickness. Warriors fell in droves, their strength undone by swollen sores and fevers that consumed them before they could lift a bow. The Mongols, unable to conquer by sword, turned to a grim weapon of desperation. Chronicles tell us that they hurled the bodies of their own dead over the city's defences with catapults, casting not only stone, but corruption into the heart of Kaffa. The defenders within watched in horror as the plague entered their midst, carried not by soldiers' feet, but by rotting flesh crashing against walls. It was an act that turned war itself into a channel for pestilence, and the city's fate was sealed. Those trapped within Kaffa faced hunger, fear, and the creeping touch of the same sickness that consumed their enemies. Rats gnawed at stores of grain, and fleas moved unchecked among the crowded streets. The merchants who had once rejoiced in the wealth of trade now prayed for survival as their families succumbed one after another. Few dared to gather in markets or churches, for the air itself seemed poisoned, and the very touch of a neighbour became cause for dread. When escape became the only hope, ships were loaded not only with goods, but with survivors desperate to flee. Yet among them travelled the hidden enemy, nestled in clothing, cargo, and the fur of vermin. The Genoese sailors, hardened by years at sea, could not fathom that their decks now carried the seeds of Europe's greatest catastrophe. In their wake, they left a city weakened, but it was the ports they reached next that would feel the true weight of what they bore. The story of Kaffa was remembered by men like Gabriele de Mussi, who described the horror of diseased corpses raining down upon the city. His account carried the sense of a world turned upside down, where the customs of war gave way to new terrors. To many, it seemed that God himself had unleashed punishment upon the earth, for never before had such a thing been witnessed. Death catapulted like a weapon, as if even burial had been denied. What began as a siege ended as a gateway. From Kaffa's harbours, ships sailed to Constantinople, to Sicily, to Genoa, and beyond, scattering the plague with every arrival. Each port that welcomed their return unknowingly opened its arms to death. The walls of Kaffa could not contain the sickness, and neither could the seas. What had been one city's tragedy now became the inheritance of all Europe. To those who lived through it, the siege seemed like a curse that spread beyond the battlefield. War had always brought hunger and ruin, yet this was different. It carried no honour, no possibility of victory. The survivors who fled carried with them memories of screams from the walls and the stench of bodies left unburied. In their eyes, the sea that had long promised wealth now shimmered with menace. Thus, Kaffa entered history, not for its riches nor for the strength of its defences, but as the threshold through which the Black Death crossed into Europe. The stones of its walls still stood, but the sickness that passed through them would echo far longer than any conquest. From that moment, the fate of continents was altered, and the course of lives far from the Black Sea was set upon a darker path. Before the shadow of pestilence fell, the lands of Europe were already stretched to their limits. Centuries of growth had swelled the population, and villages expanded until fields could no longer keep pace. Houses were pressed close in towns, streets narrow and foul with waste, for no thought was given to sewers or drains. Children played where refuse lay, and the air itself carried the sour tang of overcrowding. It was a world alive with noise and trade, yet fragile beneath its surface. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had left scars still visible. Failed harvests and cold rains had starved both man and beast, thinning herds and leaving many too weak to recover fully. Though years had passed, hunger remained a companion in poorer households, and malnutrition made bodies vulnerable to whatever illness might come. The memory of those lean years lingered like a wound that had never healed, reminding men that abundance was a fleeting guest. Kings and lords looked upon their domains with pride, yet their prosperity rested on the toil of peasants bound to the soil. Villagers worked from dawn until dusk, their lives measured in seed and harvest, their hopes pinned to weather they could not command. When crops failed, there was little safety to be found. Surplus was scarce, and hunger spread swiftly through both village and town. In such conditions, any sickness found easy ground to flourish. Cities, too, carried the weight of excess. London, Paris and Florence bustled with merchants and artisans, yet behind the grandeur of cathedrals lay alleys where people lived cheek by jowl. Waste was tossed into streets, water was fouled by every trade, and the very air was thick with smoke and stench. Rats moved freely through granaries, their numbers unnoticed in the din of daily life. What men dismissed as nuisances would soon prove the heralds of calamity. Religion shaped every breath of life, and the church stood as the pillar of order. Masses filled with prayers for health and bounty, relics kissed with fervour, candles lit for protection. Yet beneath this devotion, there was little understanding of the forces that truly governed sickness. Miasma, the belief in poisoned air, held sway over physicians, while astrology guided their warnings. Few could imagine that disease might come from creatures too small to be seen. Despite hardship, there was confidence in continuity. The rhythm of seasons, the beating of church bells, and the cycles of sowing and harvest seemed eternal. Lords collected dues, guilds thrived in cities, and monasteries copied texts by candlelight. Life was hard but familiar, bound in traditions that had endured for generations. The common folk, though weary, believed the world would remain as it always had, unbroken and predictable. Yet cracks were there for those who cared to see them. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and weakened health were silent warnings. The soil was overworked, the people overburdened, and the system strained to breaking. A single spark could ignite a fire across the continent, and none were prepared for its ferocity. They did not yet know that the spark was already on its way, carried silently across seas and roads. Thus, on the eve of the Black Death, Europe was both strong and brittle, a land full of vigour, yet built on fragile foundations. Its cathedrals reached high into heaven, but its streets swarmed with vermin. Its people prayed faithfully, but their bodies were worn and unready. It was into this delicate balance that the plague would arrive, sweeping away illusions of permanence and reshaping the very order of life. In the 14th century, when the plague descended, the healers of Europe were bound by teachings that stretched back to Galen of Pergamon. They spoke of humours, blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, believing that health was balance and sickness imbalance. Few dared to question these doctrines, for they had guided physicians for over 1,000 years. When confronted with the sudden swellings and fevers of the Black Death, they reached for these same theories, though they offered no true remedy. Tradition weighed heavier than discovery. The air was thought to be corrupted, poisoned by miasma that rolled in with foul smells or strange winds. Many covered their faces with posies or herbs, believing sweet scents could shield the lungs. Some carried pomanders of ambergris or rosemary, hoping to ward off the taint. Physicians advised avoiding the night air and staying indoors, as if walls alone could keep sickness at bay. What they did not know was that the true carriers were far smaller and swifter than air itself. Stars and planets too were blamed. Learned astrologers pointed to an alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, declaring it a cause of diseased air. Charts were drawn, calculations made, and predictions offered, yet no constellation could explain why villages vanished overnight. Still, the people listened, for when the world collapses, even the faintest explanation is grasped as a lifeline. To look upward was easier than to peer into the mysteries of the unseen. Bloodletting was a common prescription, thought to balance excess humours. Patients weakened by the plague were bled by knife or leech. Their strength drained further in the name of cure. Others were cauterized, their buboes burned with hot irons in desperate attempts to drive out corruption. Herbal mixtures, from sage to rue, were pressed into service, yet none could halt the course of the disease. In truth, the treatments often hastened death rather than delayed it. The Church offered its own guidance, declaring the plague divine punishment for sin. Confession and prayer were urged, pilgrimages taken, and relics sought with fervour. To many, this explanation rang truer than the words of physicians. The soul, they believed, must be healed before the body. But as prayers rose, the death toll mounted, and faith in remedies both sacred and secular began to fray. The sickness answered to neither incense nor sermon. Not all turned to scholars or priests. Folk healers and midwives tended the sick with poultices and charms, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations. Amulets were worn, prayers whispered in hidden corners, and old remedies brewed in village kitchens. Though often dismissed by men of learning, these women carried a quiet authority, born of centuries tending to bodies and births. Yet even their wisdom faltered against the relentless tide. The beaked masks of plague doctors, filled with herbs and vinegar-soaked cloth, became symbols of the time. These strange figures walked among the dying, dressed in long waxed coats and gloves, believing themselves protected. In truth, their garb did little against fleas and infection, but it offered a sense of order amidst chaos. To see such a figure approach was to know that death had entered one's street. Thus medicine in that age stood at a crossroads, armed with ancient wisdom, yet blind to the true nature of disease. Their failures were not born of malice, but of limits of knowledge, of tools, of sight itself. The Black Death revealed the fragility of their understanding, stripping away the illusions of certainty. In its wake, men would slowly begin to question, to observe, and to seek truth beyond tradition. The veins of commerce that once nourished Europe became the very channels through which the plague flowed. Merchants carried their wares along the Mediterranean, their ships filled with spices, silks, and grain. Yet hidden in the shadows of their cargo moved rats and fleas, bearing a cargo no man would willingly accept. Each harbour, from Venice to Marseille, became both a gateway of wealth and a door through which death stepped ashore. What once promised fortune now delivered fear. From the ports, the pestilence did not linger by the sea. It climbed the rivers, the Rhone, the Seine, the Thames, sweeping inland with the same speed as the barges. Towns along the water that once thrived on trade found themselves emptied within weeks. Caravans carried it further still, their wheels rattling along roads that wound from one settlement to the next. Each stop meant new hands to touch the goods, new bodies to breathe the infected air. Barcelona, Florence, and Pisa became early victims of their prosperity. Their wealth and bustling populations had long made them proud jewels of trade, but now these strengths became weaknesses. Crowded streets gave the pestilence easy ground, while the endless arrival of ships and carts ensured it never lacked for carriers. Men who had never travelled beyond their parish now felt the distant east pressing upon their very doorsteps. The world had grown close, and with that closeness came peril. The fairs of Champagne and Bruges, once places of festivity and profit, became sites of silent contagion. Traders gathered as they always had, exchanging bolts of cloth and barrels of wine, but within days, laughter turned to laments. Goods carried between towns bore more than dye or flavour. They bore the unseen bite of fleas. In their wake, whole households sickened, and what had been an occasion of joy became the seed of mourning. It is said that travellers spread more than stories, and in those years, this truth was made cruelly clear. A pilgrim setting out for Santiago might return not with blessings, but with sickness, unwittingly gifting it to his village. A soldier returning from campaign brought home no spoils but the fever that carried away his kin. The very bonds that tied Europe together, roads, rivers, and seas, became the very cords that tightened the noose around its throat. Some towns, fearing the approach, tried to bar their gates to outsiders. Guards stood watch, merchants were turned away, and villages closed their roads. Yet such defences proved fragile, for hunger forced trade to continue, and men desperate for work or refuge slipped through. The plague needed no army to break walls. It entered through a single cart of grain, a single rat climbing a rope, a single traveller seeking shelter. Chroniclers noted the swiftness with awe and terror. They wrote how the disease traveled faster than the messengers who carried word of it. By the time one town learned of its neighbor's ruin, its own streets already echoed with funeral bells. There was no outrunning it, for even the swiftest horse could not escape what clung invisibly to cloth and fur. Europe discovered that distance itself was no longer a defense. Thus, the networks that had once symbolized progress became the very lines along which destruction marched. The plague spread not by sword nor decree, but by the ceaseless pulse of trade and travel. What men had built over centuries in pursuit of wealth and unity was undone in mere months. The same roads that once brought bread to the hungry now delivered sorrow, and no land connected to another was left untouched. The first signs of the sickness were small, almost dismissible: a fever, a chill, a sudden weariness that weighed heavy on the limbs. Yet within hours, the body betrayed itself. Painful swellings called buboes rose beneath the arms, at the neck, and in the groin. These lumps grew hard and dark, hot to the touch, and so tender that even the brushing of a blanket brought agony. They seemed like curses blossoming beneath the skin, reminders that the sickness marked its victims without mercy. Soon, the blood itself turned against the body. Veins blackened, and skin grew mottled with dark patches, as if bruises bloomed without wound. Mouths filled with foul breath, and tongues thickened, making speech a struggle. Nausea came swiftly, followed by vomiting, sometimes blood itself. Delirium often set in, with men babbling prayers or curses, their minds unmoored from reason. The living seemed to sink into shadow, their faces unrecognizable even to their kin. Accounts from those days paint a harrowing picture. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence, told how black spots appeared upon the skin, marks that foretold certain death. He described families watching as one after another fell, often within days of the first signs. Such descriptions were no exaggeration, for the disease carried its victims from life to grave with brutal speed. Few illnesses had ever moved so swiftly, leaving so little room for hope or remedy. The senses themselves were cruelly altered. Some lost hearing or sight before the end, as if the world was closing in. Others suffered such pain in their buboes that they screamed until their voices failed. Neighbors heard these cries echoing through thin walls, chilling even the hardest of hearts. To witness such suffering was to know fear that no sermon could soothe. Even the strong, once confident in their bodies, found themselves undone by the sudden frailty of flesh. It was not only the pain that terrified, but the certainty. To see the swellings was to know what followed. Few recovered once the marks appeared, and even those who seemed to grow better often fell again within days. In a time when many sicknesses lingered for weeks, this one struck like lightning. The sickened body became a clock counting down to death, and each hour carried its own torment. Families grew afraid of their own. A husband turned away from his wife, a mother from her child, fearing the touch that once meant love. Some fled their homes entirely, leaving the sick to die alone. Others tried to stay, yet the horror of watching a beloved waste away left scars no time could erase. The plague did not only kill, it corroded trust and stripped away the bonds of intimacy. Cemeteries could not hold the numbers, for death came faster than spades could dig. In many places, carts rolled daily, gathering bodies from houses where the cries had fallen silent. The dead bore the same telltale signs: swollen nodes, blackened skin, limbs twisted by fever. Those who watched these carts pass knew well that soon they might be among them. Life had become a fragile gift, easily withdrawn without warning. So vivid were these symptoms that they burned themselves into the memory of Europe. Even generations later, men spoke of the black swellings as if they had seen them with their own eyes. The terror was not born of rumor alone, but of sight and sound too dreadful to forget. The plague made the body itself a proclamation of death, and in those years there was no escaping its mark. Between 1347 and 1351, the scythe of the plague cut deeper than any war or famine in memory. Historians speak of 1/3, others of half, of Europe's people swept away. From the bustling ports of Italy to the quiet hamlets of England, the toll was unrelenting. Entire villages emptied, their fields untended, and their homes collapsing into ruin. The sound of bells marked the passing of countless souls, until even the bells grew silent for want of those to ring them. In France, chroniclers wrote of towns where scarcely 1 in 10 survived. In the Low Countries, some regions lost so many farmers that fertile land lay abandoned, weeds overtaking the furrows once carved by ploughs. Italy fared no better. Florence and Venice, proud centers of art and commerce, saw families of wealth and lineage erased in weeks. The streets that once rang with merchants' voices echoed instead with the roll of death carts. England too endured devastation. Records of manorial rolls show sudden gaps, tenants vanishing with no heirs to claim their lands. In some parishes, half the priests perished, leaving the faithful without shepherds for their souls. Even monasteries, thought to be sanctuaries, fell quiet as their cloisters emptied. Across the countryside, the pattern repeated: death unselective, indifferent to wealth, rank, or devotion. What struck hardest was the speed with which it hollowed the land. A village might begin the week with weddings planned or markets scheduled, and end with its streets deserted. Survivors walked past shuttered homes, the silence broken only by their own footsteps. Fear was constant, for no one could predict who would fall next. The pestilence obeyed no order, respected no boundary, and spared no lineage. Graves filled faster than hands could dig. In Avignon, mass pits swallowed hundreds, sprinkled with lime to mask the stench. London, overwhelmed, saw trenches opened wide, where the dead were stacked like cordwood. The dignity of burial, once a sacred rite, gave way to haste and necessity. Priests muttered hurried prayers, their voices thin against the vastness of loss. Death had become not singular, but communal, a flood that carried all in its path. The numbers themselves, though staggering, failed to convey the emptiness left behind. Fields without farmers meant hunger for survivors. Homes without families became hollow shells. Roads once busy with pilgrims and traders grew quiet. The economy, built on countless hands, faltered as those hands disappeared. To live through those years was to feel the world shrinking, as if the very pulse of humanity had slowed to a faint beat. Contemporaries struggled to comprehend the enormity. Some believed the end of the world had come, so absolute was the ruin. Others saw in it divine judgment, a punishment that none could escape. Yet whether seen through the eyes of faith or despair, the truth was the same. Europe was diminished beyond recognition. Generations would pass before its numbers recovered, and even then, the memory remained. The Black Death did more than claim lives. It altered the very shape of the continent. Villages disappeared from maps, dynasties ended, and the balance of power shifted. Those who survived carried not only grief, but a new awareness of life's fragility. The old world had been thinned, pared down to its bones, and what rose from it would never again be as it once was. When the pestilence raged at its height, the familiar bonds that held communities together began to unravel. Town councils, once diligent in keeping markets open and streets in order, saw their members perish or flee. Officials abandoned their posts, fearing to share the fate of those they were meant to protect. With no guiding hand, rules loosened, and disorder crept into daily life. What had seemed like a solid framework of law dissolved under the sheer weight of mortality. Graveyards became the most visible sign of collapse. Churchyards overflowed with bodies, forcing the living to dig trenches in fields or pile corpses into hastily marked pits. Priests, exhausted or dead themselves, could not provide the rites demanded for so many. Funerals became hurried gestures, words spoken in haste, if spoken at all. The sacred order of death, long guarded with reverence, gave way to desperate necessity. many turned away from duty for fear overpowered obligation. Physicians vanished from cities, some seeking safer country air, others themselves struck down. Judges left benches empty, and merchants closed their stalls, leaving trade in shambles. In the absence of authority, the strong took what they could, while the weak hid or starved. Survival became the only law that many obeyed. Rumors spread faster than proclamations. Some swore that foreigners or witches had poisoned wells, others that unseen vapors cursed the land. Panic fueled suspicion, and suspicion fueled violence. With few leaders to speak reason, mobs grew bold, setting upon those they deemed guilty. What began as fear of death turned easily into cruelty against neighbors. In such times, truth had little voice. Even the clergy, who were expected to stand firm, faltered. Many fled monasteries or parishes, unwilling to tend the dying. Those who remained became rare beacons of courage, though many paid with their lives. Trust in the church weakened, for the faithful saw not the hand of protection but the back of retreat. When pillars fall, the whole structure trembles, and faith itself seemed shaken. Cities scarred by the plague often bore scars of lawlessness as well. Looters roamed abandoned houses, stripping valuables from the dead. Records were lost, debts uncollected, contracts forgotten. It was as though the very memory of order had been erased. In the countryside, bands of wanderers appeared, displaced peasants who found neither work nor welcome. Roads that once bore pilgrims became paths of beggars and thieves. Yet amidst the ruin, some communities tried to hold fast. In small villages, neighbors gathered to dig graves together, to share what food remained, to enforce makeshift rules. These efforts were fragile, yet they showed that even in collapse, a faint sense of order could survive. Still, the shadow of abandonment lingered, for everyone had seen how quickly duty could be cast aside. The collapse was not complete in every place, but the memory of it touched all. Men and women learned how thin the veil of civilization truly was, how swiftly fear could strip away laws, rituals, and obligations. In those years, public order was no stronger than the lives that upheld it, and when those lives vanished, the frame of society cracked open. From that fracture, a different Europe would emerge. Faith was the anchor to which countless souls clung as the pestilence raged. In churches across Europe, men and women gathered in trembling crowds, raising their voices in desperate prayer. They sought absolution, fearing that the plague was a rod of divine punishment. Relics were carried in solemn processions, incense burned to purify the air, and candles lit until altars glowed like fields of fire. Yet despite the prayers, the toll of death did not lessen, and many began to wonder if heaven listened at all. Among the faithful arose movements of penitence that startled even their contemporaries. The flagellants marched from town to town, stripped to the waist, lashing themselves with knotted cords until their flesh bled. They sang hymns as they struck, believing that their suffering might appease divine wrath. Crowds followed them, weeping and praying, convinced that only through shared pain could forgiveness be earned. But where they walked, fear often grew, for their fervour was as unsettling as it was sincere. Pilgrimages multiplied, though roads were perilous and inns dangerous. Families set out for shrines of saints, hoping a miracle might spare them. In Compostela, Canterbury, and Cologne, the flow of pilgrims swelled, even as the disease followed close behind. The very journeys meant to bring grace often carried contagion into new lands. Still, many preferred the risk of travel to the helplessness of waiting at home. In motion, they sought meaning, however fleeting. Clergy themselves stood divided. Some remained steadfast, ministering to the sick and dying, giving last rites in plague-ridden homes, and burying the dead with trembling hands. Others abandoned their posts, retreating to safer ground, unwilling to face such odds. The people saw both, the courage of the few and the cowardice of the many, and their faith was shaped by these contrasts. For some, devotion deepened. For others, trust in the church fractured. The papacy, then seated at Avignon, sought to guide its flock. Pope Clement VI issued bulls condemning violence against Jews and granted indulgences to those who perished of plague. Yet even the pontiff could not turn the tide. He himself was said to sit between great fires in his chambers, believing the flames would cleanse the air around him. If the shepherd of Christendom resorted to such measures, what hope was left for his sheep? Ordinary people created their own rituals of protection. Crosses were painted on doors, prayers scratched into walls, and charms worn close to the skin. In villages, families knelt in fields to pray for rain or sun, as if the heavens could be swayed by the sight of their desperation. Faith became both shield and burden, offering comfort, yet also the crushing fear that one's sins had brought ruin upon the world. Art and sermons grew heavy with visions of wrath. Preachers thundered from pulpits, declaring the plague a warning of hellfire yet to come. In marketplaces, friars urged repentance, reminding all that death spared neither king nor peasant. The language of salvation became the language of fear, and many lived as though each day might be their last. In this climate, the soul's fate weighed heavier than the body's suffering. Thus religion, though deeply woven into life, proved both balm and torment. It offered answers, yet not deliverance. It inspired acts of courage and acts of fanaticism, sometimes in the same street. The Black Death revealed the limits of faith in earthly institutions, while showing the enduring hunger of men for meaning. When death became omnipresent, belief was not abandoned but reshaped, etched into hearts with fire and with sorrow. In the midst of terror, men often sought someone to blame, and in those dark years, suspicion fell upon the Jews. Already burdened with centuries of prejudice, they became convenient scapegoats for the incomprehensible spread of the plague. Rumors whispered that they had poisoned wells or conspired in secret to bring sickness upon Christendom. Though no proof was ever shown, fear proved stronger than reason, and violence followed swiftly. In towns across the Holy Roman Empire, mobs rose against Jewish communities. Strasbourg, Basel, and Mainz all saw pogroms erupt, where synagogues were burned and entire families slain. Some Jews were offered life if they converted, while others faced the flames or the sword. Many fled eastward to Poland and Lithuania, where rulers offered some measure of protection, though never complete safety. For those who remained in the empire, survival was a fragile thread, often severed by hatred. Pope Clement VI spoke against such cruelty, issuing bulls that condemned the accusations as false. He reminded the faithful that Jews too perished of the plague and could not be its cause. Yet papal words rarely reached the villages where violence burned hottest. Local lords often looked away, unwilling to oppose the anger of the crowd or eager to seize Jewish wealth and property for themselves. The very institutions that should have defended the innocent faltered. The violence was not confined to Germany. In Spain and France, similar persecutions arose, where Jews were expelled, their belongings confiscated, and their lives torn apart. In Aragon, records tell of Jews tortured until they confessed to crimes they had not committed. Once the plague entered a town, the cycle repeated. Fear, rumor, accusation, and blood. In such a climate, truth had no purchase, and justice bent beneath the weight of hysteria. Communities that had stood for centuries were erased in a matter of weeks. Libraries of Hebrew texts were lost to fire, homes destroyed, and graveyards desecrated. The cultural life of Europe was diminished, though at the time few saw it as such. Neighbors who once traded side by side became enemies, divided not by deed, but by desperation. The plague had revealed not only the weakness of the body, but also the fragility of trust among men. For the Jews themselves, the years of the plague were an ordeal of endurance. Many chose exile, seeking places where the arm of the mob could not reach. Others endured in silence, practicing their faith in secrecy or living under the constant threat of attack. Their resilience in the face of such relentless persecution is a testament to the human spirit, though the scars of those years ran deep. The persecutions also sowed lasting consequences. Jewish life in many regions of Western Europe never recovered its former strength, shifting the center of Jewish culture eastward for generations. The very map of faith and culture was altered by violence born not of truth, but of fear. The plague, though blind in its killing, opened the door to cruelty that was all too deliberate. In remembering these persecutions, one sees clearly how terror can strip away the bonds of neighborliness and replace them with hatred. The sickness of the body gave rise to a sickness of the soul, and the two fed upon each other. The Black Death was not only a pestilence of flesh, but a mirror reflecting the darkest impulses of mankind. The world of the arts did not escape the hand of the plague. Instead, it bore its marks more deeply than stone or parchment had ever known. Painters turned their gaze toward mortality, no longer content with saints and kings alone. From cloisters and workshops emerged images of skeletons dancing with the living, the dance macabre that reminded all of death's equality. Rich and poor, young and old, no brush distinguished them, for the grave made all alike. Such art was not invention, but reflection, drawn from the daily sight of loss. Writers, too, shaped their words under this heavy shadow. Petrarch lamented that the world had become a desolate wilderness, his poetry steeped in grief for friends and loved ones lost. Boccaccio, in Florence, framed his Decameron with tales of youths fleeing the pestilence, a mirror of what so many truly attempted. Though his stories brought laughter and wit, their frame revealed sorrow, that men and women had to leave cities of death to rediscover joy. Literature carried both wounds and the longing for escape. Monuments also changed their form. Tomb effigies, once serene in noble repose, grew stark and unsettling. Sculptors carved cadavers, emaciated and hollow-eyed, lying as reminders of the fleeting body. These transy tombs spread across Europe, confronting mourners not with glory, but with decay. In such stone forms, the lesson was carved. Life was brief and death eternal. Even in remembrance, the plague demanded honesty. The church's art likewise took on darker tones. Frescoes, once radiant with heavenly triumph, were painted over with visions of judgment and despair. Angels stood side by side with demons. Scales weighed souls, and Christ was depicted as stern arbiter rather than gentle shepherd. In stained glass and altar panels, the faithful saw their own fears reflected back, urging them to repent before death claimed them unprepared. Songs changed their notes too. The merry tunes of villages gave way to dirges, chanted in slow rhythm to match the toll of bells. In monasteries, plain song echoed in empty halls, the voices of survivors carrying the weight of those silenced. Ballads whispered in taverns spoke of loss, of lovers parted, of families torn. Music, like every other craft, absorbed the grief of its age. Even plays bore the mark of plague. Morality tales, once used to teach Christian virtue, grew sharper in their warnings. Characters like Death stepped onto the stage, no longer as allegory alone, but as an ever-present companion. The audience needed no explanation, for each had seen the figure in their streets. Theatre became less escape than reflection, a mirror of their fragile existence. Yet within this somber tide, seeds of new thought were sown. By gazing so closely at mortality, men began to question the order of the world, to ponder not only the wrath of God, but the nature of human life itself. The art of grief became also the art of inquiry. From sorrow, curiosity took root, and in the generations that followed, it would bear fruit in Renaissance vision. Thus, the plague reshaped not only the body, but the imagination of Europe. What was seen in flesh was preserved in paint, in song, in tale, and in stone. Death walked with the living, and so the living learned to speak of death in every craft. The culture that emerged was steeped in mourning, yet it carried within it a new depth. a recognition that beauty and sorrow often spring from the same soil. The authority of the church had long been unquestioned, its rituals guiding every stage of life from baptism to burial. Yet when the plague swept through villages and cities, prayers and masses seemed powerless. People knelt before relics, fasted and confessed, but the pestilence did not lift. Each unanswered plea carved doubt into hearts that had once trusted fully. For the first time in centuries, many began to wonder if the shepherds of Christendom truly held the keys they claimed. The loss of clergy was staggering. In some dioceses, half the priests perished within months, leaving parishes without confession, last rites, or burial prayers. Monasteries fell silent, their libraries and cloisters emptied. Bishops struggled to fill vacant seats, sometimes ordaining men with little training just to restore a semblance of order. The shortage revealed how fragile the institution was, dependent upon human bodies no less vulnerable than their flocks. Absenteeism grew common as clerics fled to safer grounds, leaving their duties behind. Those who remained often demanded high payment for services, exploiting desperation for spiritual comfort. Such corruption deepened resentment among survivors, who felt abandoned or deceived. Where once the church had been a rock, it now seemed to some like shifting sand, steady only until the waves grew too strong. At Avignon, the papal court sought to hold authority together, yet its distance from the common man was keenly felt. Pope Clement VI offered indulgences and declared mass graves consecrated, but papal decrees seemed hollow against the reality of daily loss. The grandeur of the papacy stood in stark contrast to the misery of villages, widening the gap between shepherds and sheep. Many began to search for faith beyond the gilded halls of the hierarchy. Popular movements rose to fill the vacuum. The flagellants, marching in dramatic penance, presented themselves as true agents of God's will, uncorrupted by wealth or cowardice. Though eventually condemned by Rome, they revealed the hunger of the people for leaders who shared their suffering. Their fervour exposed the weakness of the established clergy, whose absence had created room for such voices. Faith was not lost, but it wandered, seeking new vessels. The universities that trained clerics also faltered. With students and masters alike dying, the transmission of sacred knowledge was broken. Young men ordained in haste lacked grounding, their sermons shallow, and their authority questioned. In this vacuum, lay people leaned more on their own reading, prayers, and local traditions. A slow shift had begun, one that would eventually challenge the monopoly of interpretation, once held firmly by priests. The disruption spread beyond altars into the very imagination of the faithful. If the plague could strike priests as easily as peasants, where lay divine protection? If the church could not halt the pestilence, what else might it not hold power over? These questions festered, unspoken at first, but growing in strength as the years passed. Doubt did not yet overthrow belief, but it planted seeds. Thus, the church, though it endured, emerged altered. Its authority weakened, its credibility fractured, its unity strained. The Black Death did not destroy the institution, but it cracked its foundation. In the centuries to come, those cracks would widen, paving the way for reform and for challenges that would reshape the faith of Europe forever. The pestilence struck hardest at the roots of the countryside, where the rhythm of life was bound to the plough and the harvest. Fields once busy with men and women stooping to sow or reap stood empty, the furrows half carved, the grain left to rot. Cattle lowed in untended pastures, oxen wandered without masters, and barns echoed with silence. The backbone of Europe, the toil of peasants, was broken, leaving landowners to stare helplessly at wasted acres. With so many dead, the survivors found themselves in rare demand. A ploughman who once laboured for meagre wages could now bargain for better pay or lighter dues. Lords accustomed to unquestioned obedience faced defiance from men who knew their worth had risen. The feudal chain, once held tight, loosened with every empty cottage. Necessity had shifted power, and those who tilled the soil began to sense the strength that scarcity gave them. Harvests dwindled in the years immediately following the plague. Villages that had lost half their households could not manage the same breadth of land. Grain markets faltered, and hunger spread even among survivors. The wealthy might purchase food from abroad, but common folk endured scarcity once more. What little was produced gained higher value, yet the cost of such food placed it beyond the reach of many. Suffering persisted, though its cause had changed. Manorial records tell of land left uncultivated, marked as waste in roles that once celebrated productivity. Estates that had thrived for generations crumbled, their income withering alongside their harvests. Lords attempted to bind peasants more tightly, fearful of losing their dwindling workforce. Yet death had broken old certainties, and men who once bowed to custom now walked away, seeking work where wages promised more. The countryside grew restless beneath its quiet surface. The collapse of labour also reshaped families. Widows found themselves inheriting farms, struggling to keep them alive without husbands or sons. Children were pressed into work far earlier, filling the gap left by the fallen. Communities leaned upon whoever remained, regardless of age or gender, for survival demanded that every hand be used. Though sorrow weighed heavy, the demands of the earth left no time for endless mourning. Animals, too, bore witness to the absence of men. Sheep multiplied as lords shifted from grain fields to pastures, for wool required fewer hands than wheat. Goats roamed villages, sometimes in greater number than children. This transformation of the landscape was not sudden, but steady, a silent adjustment to the lack of human labour. The very face of the countryside altered, reshaped by necessity rather than design. Some lords turned to harsher laws to restore control. In England, the Statute of Labourers attempted to freeze wages at their old levels, forbidding peasants from demanding more. Yet such decrees proved fragile, for laws cannot bind men when hunger and opportunity pull them elsewhere. Resistance simmered, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, as the rural poor began to test their new leverage against their masters. The rural labour crisis was more than an economic wound. It was a shift in the balance of society. The death of so many had given voice to those long silenced, even if only in whispers at first. Though hardship remained, the seeds of change had been sown in the soil alongside the wasted grain. From the emptiness of fields would grow not only hunger, but also a slow and profound reordering of Europe's social life. When death had thinned the villages and towns, the survivors carried not only grief, but new expectations. They had seen their labour become precious, their absence felt by lords who once overlooked them. Yet attempts to bind them back into poverty bred bitterness. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 tried to hold wages at their former level, denying peasants the fair reward their scarcity had earned. Such laws struck not as justice, but as chains reforged, and resentment began to smoulder. The anger first showed itself quietly, in refusals, in wanderers leaving their manors, in murmured defiance at dues once paid without question. But over time, discontent took louder forms. In 1381, fields and villages emptied not from plague but from rebellion, as thousands marched toward London in what came to be known as the Peasants' Revolt. Led by voices like Wat Tyler and John Ball, the common folk demanded an end to serfdom and a recognition of their dignity. The march was more than chaos, it was charged with vision. John Ball preached of a world where all men stood equal, asking, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? His words struck deep, for they reminded listeners of a truth older than lords and titles. The peasants, weary of burdens, carried not only pitchforks and clubs, but also an idea that the order of society might be remade. In London, the rebels stormed through gates, their numbers overwhelming. They destroyed manorial records that bound them to feudal duties. Symbols of oppression turned to ash. The king, Richard II, still a youth, faced them with promises, granting charters of freedom to calm the storm. For a brief moment, the dream of liberation flickered alive. carried on the breath of thousands who had long been voiceless. Yet that flame was soon quenched. The revolt's leaders were killed, charters revoked, and vengeance fell upon villages that had risen. What Tyler was struck down during negotiations, his blood marking the end of open defiance. The lords reasserted control, punishing harshly those who had dared to challenge their rule. Still, though the rebellion was crushed, the memory of it could not be erased. Across Europe, echoes of this unrest sounded in other uprisings. In France, the Jacquerie saw peasants rise with equal fury, attacking castles and noble houses, only to be slaughtered in reprisal. In Flanders and elsewhere, workers and farmers alike pressed for relief from feudal dues. Though most revolts ended in blood, each left cracks in the feudal order, revealing the growing strain between those who laboured and those who ruled. The nobles saw these movements as threats, but they were also symptoms of a deeper truth. The old balance was breaking. The plague had made clear that without peasants, lords had no power, no food, no wealth. Even if revolt was beaten back, the memory lingered that common men had once stood in defiance together. That knowledge itself was dangerous, for it could not be unlearned. The peasants' revolts stand as a reminder that suffering can awaken courage, and scarcity can awaken demands for justice. Though victories were short-lived, they sowed ideas that would outlast the swords that cut them down. The plague had weakened bonds of obedience, and rebellion gave voice to the cracks in feudal rule. From that soil of hardship and uprising, a new consciousness was born, and Europe would never again be quite the same. In the years after the Great Pestilence, the very structure of Europe's economy began to shift beneath men's feet. With so many labourers lost, landowners found their estates crumbling, unable to sustain the vast grain fields they once boasted. The shortage of hands forced innovation, pushing some to turn from crops to sheep, whose wool demanded less labour yet brought greater profit. This change altered not only the countryside, but the flow of wealth itself, as textiles grew into the heart of commerce. Guilds within the cities, long overshadowed by noble power, gained new prominence. Artisans and craftsmen could command better terms, their work no longer drowned in abundance. Shoemakers, weavers, and blacksmiths found their skills valued as never before. Urban centres, though scarred by death, began to reshape themselves into places where trade and craft had greater weight than feudal obligation. The balance between city and countryside leaned slowly toward the towns. Wealth grew more concentrated in some places, as survivors inherited land, tools, and houses from relatives lost. Families that had once scraped by suddenly found themselves in possession of multiple plots. Such shifts unsettled the rigid hierarchies of the old order, for poverty and privilege alike could change hands with startling speed. Fortune, once thought bound by lineage, was now subject to the whims of survival. Merchants adapted with quick resolve. Italian city-states, already rich in trade, capitalized on the demand for wool and cloth, exporting to lands eager for fine fabric. Banking families rose in influence, offering loans to nobles desperate to maintain their status. Commerce, though wounded by disruption, revived with new vigor, its arteries reshaped by necessity. Out of scarcity came opportunity, and those who seized it laid the groundwork for later wealth. The diet of the people, too, shifted in subtle ways. With fewer mouths to feed, some enjoyed access to better food, meat, dairy, and ale, once rare on common tables. For others, scarcity lingered, but the general rise in wages gave survivors more say over what they ate. Such changes touched daily life deeply, reminding people that hardship could sometimes yield small mercies for those who endured. Currency itself took on new importance. Where barter and service had once dominated, coin increasingly became the measure of exchange. Lords, no longer able to command feudal dues as before, began to demand or accept payment in money. The move toward a cash economy strengthened towns and markets, binding Europe more closely into a web of trade that reached beyond its borders. The wealth of survivors also found its way into culture. With fewer heirs, Some fortunes were spent on churches, paintings, or civic projects, sparking a patronage that helped art and learning blossom in the generations ahead. Even mourning could lead to creation, as monuments and chapels rose in memory of the dead. The economy, reshaped by loss, became an unlikely cradle for renewal. The transformation was not sudden, but steady, carried on the backs of necessity and invention. The Black Death had stripped the land of people, but in doing so, it loosened old bonds and forged new patterns. From abandoned fields and emptied homes arose new ways of working, trading, and living. In sorrow's wake, the foundations of a different economy took root, and Europe began its slow passage into a changed age. The cities of Europe, once vibrant centers of trade and faith, bore the plague's heaviest wounds. Streets that had thrived with merchants and craftsmen fell eerily silent. Entire quarters were left deserted, their houses shuttered, their workshops abandoned. In Florence, Paris, and London, the bustle of life gave way to hollow echoes, as if the walls themselves mourned the absence of their inhabitants. The grandeur of cathedrals stood unchanged, yet the congregations that once filled them had thinned to shadows. Decay crept into the very fabric of urban life. Markets withered as fewer traders arrived. Guilds faltered for want of members, and artisans left behind empty benches and silent tools. Buildings, neglected by families lost, began to crumble, roofs caving in and weeds overtaking courtyards. Rats multiplied in these ruins, a cruel reminder of the pestilence that had emptied them. Cities, which had been engines of growth, seemed for a time to sink into their own graves. Yet decline was not the final word. In the years that followed, survivors found space and opportunity within the emptiness. Overcrowding, once the curse of every city, gave way to breathing room. Streets could be widened, new dwellings constructed, and sanitation slowly improved. What had been a press of humanity now allowed for order to be imposed. Loss became the strange midwife of renewal, reshaping towns from within. Florence, so deeply scarred, later rose with vigor as bankers and merchants consolidated wealth left by the dead. Venice, though wounded, strengthened its maritime networks, learning to manage the constant threat of disease with quarantine measures. Even London, diminished in numbers, began to evolve, laying down patterns of governance and trade that would shape its future growth. From ruin, adaptation took hold, and resilience proved stronger than despair. Architecture shifted too. As families rebuilt, larger homes with gardens replaced cramped quarters. Public works were sponsored by both civic leaders and the newly wealthy, eager to display gratitude for survival or memorialize the lost. Streets that had once been choked with waste began, in some places, to see rudimentary drains and improved paving. Though progress was uneven, the notion that the city itself could be reshaped had taken root. Guilds reorganized as well, filling gaps left by the fallen. Membership opened to new blood, and fresh ideas mingled with tradition. The shortage of skilled hands meant apprentices advanced more quickly, bringing youthful energy into trades. Commerce, once stilled, found ways to stir again, driven by necessity and the determination of those who remained. In the silence of decline, the seeds of renewal were being planted. The memory of desolation lingered, reminding all of how fragile the city's life could be. But it also forged a determination to prepare, to strengthen walls, store grain, and care for water supplies. The plague taught bitter lessons about vulnerability, and those lessons were etched into the very structure of towns. Urban life, though shaken, emerged more cautious and more deliberate in its growth. Thus, the tale of the cities is one of ruin entwined with rebirth. The Black Death hollowed them, yet it also gave space for reimagining. From the ashes of depopulation, streets widened, guilds reshaped, and governance adjusted. Though grief marked every stone, the renewal that followed revealed the resilience of human community, determined to carve new life from the ruins of sorrow. The plague struck without mercy, but in its aftermath, new roles opened where old certainties had crumbled. With so many men lost, women stepped into spaces once barred to them. In towns, widows inherited their husbands' shops, continuing the trade of weaving, brewing, or baking. Some thrived as independent heads of households, their names recorded in guild rolls where few women had appeared before. Necessity made space where tradition had resisted. In the countryside, too, change stirred. Fields could not be left untended, and women took to plough and scythe alongside surviving men. Their labour was no longer confined to dairy and garden. Now they stood as keepers of the larger harvest. Villages relied upon them, and though old customs still weighed heavy, reality bent the rules. The earth does not wait for permission, and in answering its call, women's presence became indispensable. Legal records from England and France reveal women pressing claims in courts, defending property rights gained through inheritance. Some managed estates, negotiating with tenants and collecting rents, roles that once fell to absent or dead husbands. Though often challenged, their authority could not be denied when no male heir stood ready. The law itself, reluctantly, made space for them, shaping a precedent that outlasted the immediate crisis. Within guilds, opportunities widened. Though full membership remained rare, women found openings as apprentices or assistants. Textile trades, in particular, saw their influence grow as spinning and weaving became lifelines of commerce. In some towns, records speak of brewsters and alewives, women who made livelihoods brewing beer for communities. Their presence was not always welcomed, but it was undeniable, for survival outweighed prejudice. The plague also altered the rhythms of family. With fewer men to marry, some women remained single, shaping lives outside the bonds of wedlock. Convents filled with those seeking safety or purpose, while others lived independently in towns, sustaining themselves through craft or service. Such lives had existed before, but now they appeared in greater number, forming a quiet redefinition of womanhood in Europe. This newfound visibility did not erase limitations. Patriarchy remained strong, and many gains were fragile, often reversed once stability returned. Yet the memory lingered of a time when women had stepped forward, carrying burdens beyond the hearth. Their presence in workshops, fields, and courts could not be entirely forgotten. What was once unthinkable had been lived, and that reality left its trace. Cultural views began to shift, though slowly. Writers and preachers noted women's endurance, sometimes praising their devotion, sometimes condemning their independence. Art, too, reflected both admiration and unease, depicting women as both caretakers and temptresses in the wake of calamity. The tension between necessity and tradition became part of the fabric of post-plague Europe, a silent contest between memory and custom. The Black Death, in reshaping households and labour, inadvertently reshaped women's place within society. Though not an equal transformation, it cracked open doors long sealed, showing possibilities where once there had been only silence. The memory of those years whispered of resilience and adaptability, lessons carried forward by generations of daughters who had seen their mothers stand where men once stood. The pestilence did not halt at the frontiers of Christendom. It swept also through the Islamic realms of the Middle East and North Africa. Cairo, the jewel of Egypt, counted its dead by the tens of thousands in a single day. The great city that had thrived on the grain of the Nile and the learning of Al-Azhar University became a place of weeping. Merchants closed their stalls, and scholars laid down their pens, unable to withstand the tide of loss that pressed on every quarter. In Damascus, too, the plague tore through the heart of society. Mosques echoed with prayers as citizens gathered, seeking mercy from God. Yet even the most pious fell, and entire families were erased within days. Ibn Battuta, the great traveller, witnessed the devastation firsthand, describing streets emptied and businesses abandoned. The city that had welcomed pilgrims and traders alike fell into silence, its busy life broken by unseen hands. Baghdad, once the center of the Abbasid caliph's power, was already weakened by earlier invasions, yet the plague deepened its ruin. The survivors who remained clung to a diminished city, stripped of much of its grandeur. Trade along the great rivers dwindled as fear and sickness followed every boat. The Empire of Islam, vast and interconnected, felt the same vulnerability as Europe, for no wall nor faith was proof against the pestilence. Chroniclers, such as Ibn Khaldun, left us words heavy with sorrow. He wrote that entire dynasties collapsed, cities diminished, and knowledge itself faltered because there were no men left to carry it forward. His lament was not for numbers alone, but for the unraveling of society's very fabric. Civilization, he declared, had been struck at its root. In his testimony, we see how deeply the plague carved itself into the memory of the Islamic world. Markets and caravans suffered as well. The Silk Road, already a channel of affliction, now became a corridor of emptiness. Traders who once journeyed from Samarkand to Aleppo found fewer buyers and greater dangers. Caravanserais that had bustled with life grew vacant, their doors swinging open to winds rather than to guests. Commerce, the lifeblood of empires, slowed to a trickle under the weight of fear and loss. Religious leaders interpreted the calamity as a trial from God. Some urged submission and patience, while others called for mass prayers and processions. Mosques filled with supplicants, yet the disease marched on undeterred. The paradox weighed heavily on the faithful. How could so much devotion yield so little reprieve? Like in Christendom, the certainty of religious authority trembled, though belief itself endured. The agricultural heartlands of the Nile and Mesopotamia bore scars similar to those of Europe. With workers gone, fields turned barren, canals silted up, and harvests declined. Villages shrank, and hunger compounded grief. The balance between city and countryside, delicate at the best of times, buckled beneath the loss. Survivors faced not only mourning, but the long toil of rebuilding what disease had undone. Thus, the plague in the Islamic world mirrored the tragedy of Europe, binding distant lands in a shared grief. Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, names once spoken with awe, were brought low by the same unseen foe. Across faiths and cultures, the lesson was the same. Human greatness is fragile, and even the mightiest civilizations can be humbled in a season of sorrow. Not all communities met the plague with surrender. Some sought ways to resist its spread. Along the Adriatic coast, the city of Ragusa imposed a bold measure in 1377. Travelers arriving by sea were required to remain outside the walls for 40 days before entering. From this practice came the very word quarantine, a shield of time against the invisible invader. Though imperfect, such measures slowed contagion and revealed a dawning sense that human action could influence fate. Elsewhere, towns attempted cordons and closures, barring entry to strangers and isolating the sick. Markets were suspended, fairs cancelled, and travellers turned away at the gates. Villages posted guards to prevent the arrival of outsiders, even at the cost of trade. These defences were not always successful, for rats and fleas cared little for walls, but they reflected a new instinct: to treat sickness not as destiny alone, but as something that could be contained. In homes, families devised their own methods of protection. Some burned aromatic woods or scattered herbs on their floors, believing that fragrant air might repel corruption. Others sealed windows or fled to remote cottages, hoping that distance would keep them safe. Though these practices rested on misunderstanding, they carried a logic of separation that echoed the more formal quarantines. Survival often lay not in knowledge, but in instinctive caution. The wealthy sought refuge in country estates, retreating from the press of urban life. Boccaccio himself described how groups of Florentines withdrew into villas, carrying with them food, music, and stories to escape the horror within city walls. Such retreats could delay exposure, but the plague's reach was long, and even secluded manors sometimes fell victim. Yet the attempt revealed how class shaped survival. The poor had little choice but to remain. Some communities organized collective responses. In Milan, Infected houses were sealed, their inhabitants trapped inside. Harsh though it was, this policy spared the city from the worst devastation seen elsewhere. In Venice, the authorities began to develop permanent health boards, seeking to manage the constant threat of reintroduction through trade. These experiments laid foundations for the systems of public health that would evolve in later centuries. Travel slowed dramatically, as fear made men wary of inns, markets, and roads. Pilgrims hesitated to embark, and merchants curtailed their routes. Yet the pause in movement was itself a survival strategy, breaking the chains along which disease had once flowed so quickly. The stillness of Europe in those years was both a mark of grief and a form of protection, a silence imposed by necessity. Communities also leaned on mutual aid. Neighbors brought food to one another, dug graves together, or nursed the sick when no priest or doctor remained. Though fear often drove men apart, courage sometimes drew them close. The chronicles preserve tales of quiet heroism, where ordinary folk chose compassion despite the risks. Such moments of solidarity, though fragile, gave light in the surrounding darkness. From these varied efforts arose a new awareness that survival was not entirely beyond human grasp. Though the plague could not be stopped, its course could be altered, delayed, or softened by collective action. In the midst of despair, Europe discovered the beginnings of prevention, a recognition that the choices of men and women could shape their fate, even against so relentless an enemy. Though physicians of the 14th century could not halt the pestilence, its devastation forced them to look with sharper eyes at the human body. Universities in Paris, Bologna, and Montpellier began to question the reliance on ancient texts alone. Autopsies, once rare and even frowned upon, grew more common as scholars sought to understand the workings of flesh. The need to explain death sparked curiosity that tradition alone could no longer satisfy. Out of tragedy, inquiry was born. Old authorities such as Galen and Hippocrates were still revered, but their words no longer carried unquestioned certainty. Some doctors began to note the limits of humoral theory, recognizing that illness did not always follow the patterns of imbalance it prescribed. Observation of symptoms, where buboes appeared, how swiftly death followed, was recorded more carefully. The sickness forced medicine to attend to what was seen, not only what was read. The spread of the plague across borders also encouraged collaboration among scholars. Reports traveled from Italy to France, from Spain to England, describing the stages of illness and the results of various remedies. Though their cures failed, the very act of comparing notes was a step toward a more empirical method. Medicine began, slowly, to think in terms of evidence rather than authority. Public authorities, desperate to protect their cities, invited physicians to advise on measures of prevention. In Venice, health boards sought the counsel of learned men to devise quarantines and regulations for burial. Though their reasoning was still bound to fears of miasma, the attempt to involve medical opinion in civic policy marked a new partnership. The doctor was no longer only a private healer, but a figure engaged in public welfare. Anatomical study gained momentum as well. The University of Bologna, already famed for its dissections, expanded its practices, offering students greater opportunities to learn directly from the human form. Drawings and notes from these studies began to circulate, laying groundwork for the more advanced anatomical works of the Renaissance. Curiosity about the body, long constrained, began to stir with new intensity. Pharmacology, too, advanced in small ways. Apothecaries experimented with mixtures of herbs, resins, and minerals, recording their effects more systematically. While none provided a cure for plague, the habit of testing and documenting grew. Recipes that had once been guarded secrets were sometimes shared more widely as desperation outweighed jealousy. In this way, even failure planted seeds for later discovery. The memory of helplessness lingered in the minds of healers. It made some turn to superstition, but others to study. The inability to save the sick gnawed at pride and compelled a search for better tools. In this restlessness lay the beginnings of a medicine that would one day stand on firmer ground. The plague, though it broke bodies, also broke the complacency of tradition. Thus, the catastrophe that exposed the weakness of medieval medicine also opened the path for renewal. By forcing physicians to observe, to question, and to collaborate, it prepared the soil for Renaissance science. The Black Death was a teacher harsh beyond measure, but its lessons endured, carried forward by those who refused to turn away from the mystery of life and death. The years of pestilence did not fade when the bodies were buried. They lingered in the minds of the living. Men and women who had seen whole households vanish carried visions that no sleep could soften. To walk through a silent street where once laughter had filled the air was to feel the weight of absence pressing upon the heart. Survivors lived with the constant memory that life could be extinguished in a breath. Fear became not only an event, but a companion. Many grew fatalistic, convinced that destiny ruled beyond human effort. If death could strike so suddenly, then planning for tomorrow seemed vain. Some surrendered to pleasure, living as though each day might be their last. Taverns and feasts found greater custom, not from joy, but from defiance of despair. Others turned inward, growing somber and cautious, mistrustful of even the smallest gathering. Both excess and restraint were born from the same wound. The obsession with mortality found expression in daily life. Tombs bore grim effigies, skeletons danced in frescoes, and sermons warned constantly of death's nearness. The memento mori, a reminder to remember death, became part of the rhythm of thought. Even children grew up in its shadow, learning early that life's thread was fragile. Generations were shaped by this awareness, carrying a heaviness that even prosperity could not erase. Communities themselves bore scars. Neighbors who had once stood together now remembered betrayals. Friends who had fled. Priests who had abandoned their flock. Kin who refused to tend the sick. Trust was weakened, leaving cracks that endured long after the plague receded. To live alongside others required caution, for memories of fear and abandonment lay close to the surface. Bonds once strong had been tested, and not all had endured. Some found solace in religion, yet even this was tinged with dread. Processions of penitence, endless prayers, and the haunting songs of flagellants left their mark upon the collective mind. Faith remained, but it carried sharper edges, heavier with guilt and fear. For many, God was seen less as a source of comfort than as a stern judge who had shown mankind its frailty. Spiritual life was reshaped by sorrow, coloured dark with memory. The trauma also shaped literature and storytelling. Tales dwelled on ruin, on sudden loss, on the fickleness of fortune. Writers like Petrarch spoke with bitterness of a world emptied of friends. Plays and ballads echoed with melancholy, urging listeners to ponder their own end. Even when art sought joy, it could not escape the shadow of remembrance, for grief lay beneath every attempt at laughter. Whole generations inherited the weight of these memories. Children born after the worst years grew up in societies where silence and caution reigned. Parents spoke often of those lost, shaping identities around absence rather than presence. Villages and towns defined themselves by who had perished, the memory of the plague becoming part of their story as surely as their churches or markets. Trauma became an heirloom, passed from one age to the next. Thus, the plague scarred more than flesh. It scarred the mind and soul of Europe. Its echoes endured not in bones alone, but in memory, in custom, in the very way men and women viewed their place in the world. To survive was not simply to live on, but to carry forward the weight of sorrow. The Black Death's greatest shadow was not only death itself, but the memory of it that never lifted. When the pestilence withdrew its hand, the land it left behind was unevenly marked. France and Italy, where the first great wave struck fiercest, lost such numbers that generations passed before their fields, and towns regained their former strength. In contrast, England and the Low Countries, though deeply scarred, recovered more swiftly. Their survivors found greater access to land and higher wages, allowing them to rebuild with resilience. The map of Europe itself was reshaped by these imbalances. Villages in many regions disappeared entirely, reduced to nothing more than ruins swallowed by weeds. Parish records fell silent, their churches abandoned to wind and rain. Yet nearby, other settlements persisted, sometimes even thriving in the wake of decline. Populations concentrated in stronger towns, abandoning weaker hamlets that could not endure. The pattern of habitation shifted, consolidating human life into fewer but sturdier centres. In England, the manorial roles testify to this transformation. Families once bound to small strips of land now held broader fields, their claims expanded by inheritance. Labourers, scarce in number, could command better terms, leading many to move in search of higher wages. This mobility altered the old order, unfastening peasants from the soil in ways feudal law had once forbidden. Movement became part of survival. The Low Countries benefited from these changes, as their towns grew into bustling centres of trade. Antwerp, Bruges, and later Amsterdam drew new inhabitants, their prosperity enhanced by access to wider markets. With fewer mouths to feed, resources could be directed into commerce and craft, drawing migrants from surrounding regions. Thus, decline in one place often fueled growth in another, redistributing life across borders. Southern Europe bore heavier burdens. Italy's urban splendour dimmed, with Florence, Venice, and Genoa each losing much of their populations. Recovery was slow, hindered by recurring outbreaks that returned like unwelcome guests. Yet even here, survivors inherited wealth and land, giving rise to merchant families whose fortunes later supported the flowering of Renaissance art and thought. From loss came concentration, and from concentration, power. Eastern Europe, by contrast, saw opportunity in depopulation further west. Lords in Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia invited settlers to their lands, offering favourable terms to draw labour. This influx altered the cultural and linguistic fabric of those regions, strengthening ties between East and West. The plague, though devastating, thus became a force of migration, shifting the balance of population across the continent. This redistribution also touched military and political power. Kingdoms with reduced populations struggled to field armies, while those less affected found relative advantage. England, for example, emerged with a stronger position in labour and resources compared to France, which staggered beneath heavier losses. The very conflicts of the age, including the 100 Years' War, were shaped by these uneven wounds. The Black Death did not merely lessen Europe's numbers, it rearranged them. Some lands shrank into silence, others found unexpected strength, and still others invited new peoples into their fields and towns. The shifting of populations was both a tragedy and a transformation, creating a new landscape from the fragments of the old. In the movement of survivors, the future paths of nations were quietly being drawn. The plague did not simply take lives, it unravelled the old bonds that had long tied lord and peasant together. Feudal dues, once enforced by custom and fear, became difficult to collect when so many tenants lay in the grave. Landlords, desperate to hold their estates intact, found themselves bargaining with men they once commanded. The rigid hierarchy, upheld for centuries, began to bend under the pressure of absence. With labour scarce, peasants discovered they could refuse tasks or demand lighter burdens. Some abandoned their manors entirely, seeking better wages elsewhere. This mobility struck at the very heart of feudalism, which depended on the immobility of the serf. When a ploughman could walk away and find work with a new master, the chain of obligation weakened. The freedom to choose, once rare, became more common in practice than in law. Manorial records show increasing numbers of deserted holdings. Entire villages lay empty, and lords, once wealthy from dues and rents, faced decline. Some attempted to enforce traditional obligations more harshly, resorting to laws and threats. but the ground beneath them had shifted. Power no longer flowed only downward. It now ebbed and swelled according to the choices of the survivors. A quiet revolution had begun in the fields. The shift was not uniform. In some regions, especially in Eastern Europe, lords tightened their grip, binding peasants more firmly into serfdom as they sought to prevent flight. This second serfdom contrasted sharply with the West, where peasants gained greater freedom. The plague thus deepened the division of Europe, sending its societies along different paths that would echo for centuries. For nobles, the loss of income spurred new strategies. Many turned to sheep farming or leased land to tenants for fixed sums, abandoning the direct management of labour. This change fostered a market economy, loosening the web of personal obligations that had defined feudal life. The manor was no longer the absolute unit of society. Money and contracts began to replace oaths and custom. The decline of feudal structures also altered justice. Manorial courts, once central to rural life, lost authority as villages emptied and peasants sought other allegiances. Royal courts, with broader reach, gained influence, tying the common people more directly to the crown. The weakening of the lord's local power laid a foundation for the strengthening of centralized monarchies. For the peasants, these changes brought both hope and uncertainty. Greater freedom meant greater risk, for without the lord's protection, they faced the dangers of famine and war more alone. Yet the memory of servitude weighed heavier still, and many chose the risks of independence over the security of bondage. Feudalism had promised stability, but it had crumbled before the pestilence as surely as any stone wall. Thus the Black Death reshaped the very order of society. What had once seemed eternal proved fragile, and the balance between lord and peasant was forever altered. Feudalism did not vanish overnight, but its foundation cracked, and through those cracks, new ways of life emerged. The world that rose in the plague's wake was a world less bound by oaths of fealty and more open to the stirrings of change. In the years after the pestilence, the weakening of feudal lords created space for kings to extend their reach. Nobles, once powerful enough to resist the crown, found their households diminished and their tenants gone. With estates collapsing, many became dependent upon royal favour for survival. Monarchs seized this moment, drawing more authority into their courts and strengthening the hand of centralized rule. From loss emerged a new balance of power, tilted toward the crown. France, though devastated by plague and war alike, witnessed its monarchy slowly consolidate strength. The Valois kings, weakened at first, used the vacuum left by dying nobles to expand their influence. Taxes, once resisted, now flowed more directly to the crown, as the chaos of feudal fragmentation gave way to necessity. The memory of disorder made central order more acceptable, even to those who once cherished local rule. England, too, found its monarchy reinforced despite unrest. The revolts of peasants and the deaths of lords shifted wealth and lands into royal hands. Kings used these gains to support professional armies, reducing reliance on feudal levies. The loyalty of knights once bound by fealty was now purchased with wages, drawing warriors closer to the crown than to local lords. Political authority began to wear the shape of nationhood. In Spain, the crowns of Castile and Aragon likewise grew in stature. As the nobility weakened, monarchs pursued the Reconquista with renewed vigor, binding their people together under banners of faith and conquest. The decline of feudal checks opened the path toward a unity that would later culminate in the joining of kingdoms. The seeds of centralized rule were sown in fields once emptied by plague. This strengthening of kingship did not erase hardship. Monarchs faced empty treasuries and restless subjects, but they commanded more directly than before. Bureaucracies expanded, with clerks and officials replacing some of the authority once exercised by feudal courts. The language of governance shifted from personal loyalty to written law and royal decree. Slowly, the state took shape, larger than any single household or estate. The military, too, reflected this transformation. With fewer lords able to muster men, kings relied increasingly on paid soldiers, often mercenaries. Warfare itself began to change. moving away from the feudal levy toward armies that served the realm rather than the manor. The crown, holding the purse, also held the sword. This centralization of force marked a decisive step toward the modern nation. The plague had shown the dangers of fragmentation. Communities abandoned by lords turned instinctively to stronger centers of power. The king's authority, though distant, offered a stability that feudal ties had failed to provide. Out of devastation, the idea of belonging not merely to a manor, but to a kingdom, grew clearer. Identity itself began to shift from local to national bonds. Thus, the Black Death, while tearing apart the old order, unwittingly nurtured the birth of new states. Kings rose as lords fell, central power grew as local power waned, and the concept of the nation-state began to take form. The monarchy, tempered in the fire of crisis, became the axis around which new Europe would turn. From sorrow's ruins, the structures of modern governance began their long ascent. The wars of the 14th century did not cease when the plague arrived, but they were forced to change their rhythm. Armies, already fragile in supply, saw their numbers cut by death and desertion. Campaigns of the 100 Years' War stalled as soldiers fell sick or refused to march into stricken regions. Castles and towns, once besieged by steel, were now surrendered to silence, as pestilence accomplished what armies could not. Strategy bent to a new, invisible enemy. The shortage of men compelled rulers to rethink the composition of their forces. Feudal levies, raised through obligation, dwindled as vassals vanished or refused service. Kings turned increasingly to professional soldiers, men paid in coin rather than bound by loyalty. Mercenaries filled the gap, selling their swords to whoever could afford them. Though costly, they offered consistency, marking the decline of the old feudal host. Such reliance on mercenaries brought its own troubles. Bands of soldiers, dismissed when wars paused, often roamed the countryside, plundering villages and farms. In France, the routiers became notorious, their lawlessness compounding the misery already left by plague. Kings and nobles alike feared these wandering companies, which could be as destructive as any invading army. Stability of rule required new systems to keep such men in check. Naval warfare, too, felt the weight of the pestilence. Crews of galleys and merchant fleets shrank as sailors succumbed, disrupting supply lines and coastal defenses. Venice and Genoa, reliant on maritime strength, faced shortages that weakened their reach abroad. Trade and war alike faltered when ships could not be manned. Disease at sea proved as deadly as arrows in battle, reshaping the balance of naval power. The plague also reshaped fortifications. Lords, unable to garrison their castles fully, sometimes abandoned smaller strongholds to concentrate resources on larger ones. Some fortresses fell into disrepair, never to be rebuilt, as the expense outweighed the need. War had long been measured by stone and manpower, but the pestilence taught rulers that even walls could not guarantee security. Empty castles stood as monuments to shifting priorities. In England and France, taxation for war met new resistance. With populations reduced, fewer shoulders bore the burden of levies, and discontent flared. Rebellions such as the Jacquerie and the English Peasants' Revolt had roots not only in social strain, but also in the demands of kings still bent on war. The plague had weakened the base, yet rulers still sought to wage conflicts on old terms. The tension between need and capacity grew sharper. Military technology advanced in part because of these strains. The longbow, already feared, gained prominence as armies leaned on smaller, more effective forces. Siege weapons remained, but their use was tempered by dwindling manpower. Efficiency became the watchword of survival, as rulers sought weapons that could multiply the strength of fewer men. Out of scarcity arose ingenuity. Thus, the Black Death changed not only the numbers of the battlefield, but its very structure. Feudal levies gave way to paid troops, mercenaries grew in influence, and strategies adapted to disease as much as to the enemy's sword. War, once the proud endeavor of knights and banners, became a harsher, leaner struggle. The plague had rewritten the rules, leaving an imprint on warfare as lasting as on society itself. The plague first shattered the arteries of trade, silencing markets and halting caravans. Merchants feared to travel, for roads carried not only goods, but contagion. Ships lay idle in harbours, their sails furled as crews dwindled. The once bustling fairs of Champagne, Bruges, and Frankfurt, where nations mingled in commerce, shrank to shadows of themselves. For a time, Europe seemed to retreat inward, its lifeblood of exchange cut thin. Yet from this disruption, new centres of power emerged. Italian city-states, especially Florence and Venice, adapted swiftly, harnessing banking and credit to strengthen their position. Florence's wool industry flourished as landowners shifted to sheep and fed raw material into urban looms. Venice, scarred by repeated outbreaks, nonetheless mastered maritime routes, pioneering quarantine systems that allowed trade to resume with caution. Their resilience marked them as leaders of a changing economy. Elsewhere, towns that survived with healthier populations gained advantage over rivals. The Low Countries rose in prominence, with Bruges and later Antwerp becoming magnets of northern trade. The Rhine and North Sea grew vital channels, linking markets that had once depended more heavily on overland fares. A new geography of commerce unfolded, shaped as much by survival as by strategy. Gold and silver also moved differently after the plague. Survivors inherited wealth from kin, concentrating resources in fewer hands. This capital sought investment, not only in land, but in ventures across seas and borders. Merchant families, enriched by inheritance and trade, became patrons of art and politics, using commerce to carve their names into history. The redistribution of wealth altered the face of urban society. Long-distance trade with Asia and the Islamic world faltered in the short term, but regained momentum in new forms. Caravans resumed, but with tighter controls, and seaborne routes gained greater importance. Genoese and Venetian merchants turned increasingly to the Mediterranean, while Portuguese eyes looked beyond toward the Atlantic. The plague had revealed both the fragility and necessity of wide networks, urging exploration and adaptation. Markets themselves were transformed by the scarcity of people. With fewer mouths to feed, demand for grain diminished, while demand for luxury goods grew among survivors enriched by inheritance. Artisans responded, producing finer cloth, jewelry, and household items, feeding a culture that celebrated beauty alongside sorrow. The material world adjusted to the new desires of a society reshaped by loss. Commerce also taught rulers harsh lessons. They saw that prosperity could vanish in a season if routes were not protected and cities not safeguarded. Health boards, port inspections, and quarantine stations grew not from mercy, but from mercantile necessity. Trade and governance entwined, for without safe exchange, kingdoms risked collapse. The foundation of future commercial empires was laid in these cautious beginnings. Thus, the Black Death, though it crippled trade at first, eventually spurred its transformation. Old hubs weakened, new ones rose, and commerce adapted to the rhythms of survival. The flow of goods, wealth, and ideas shifted, carving paths that would lead Europe not only toward recovery, but toward expansion and exploration. From the silence of empty markets, a different economy began to speak. The great pestilence forced cities to confront sickness not only as a private sorrow, but as a matter of governance. In places like Venice, permanent health boards were established, charged with monitoring disease and enforcing measures of control. These magistrates, though primitive in their knowledge, marked the first stirrings of organized public health. Their decrees touched all who entered the city, merchant and beggar alike, binding health to civic duty. Quarantine became a lasting legacy. Ports began to require arriving ships to wait in isolation before docking, sometimes for 30 or 40 days. Though based on imperfect theories of miasma, the practice slowed contagion and saved lives. Ragusa and Venice led the way, building dedicated quarantine stations, known as lazarettos, where both goods and travelers were confined. From these beginnings, the idea of separating the sick from the healthy took root in European law. Burial practices also changed. Overcrowded graveyards had forced the use of mass pits, but cities soon imposed stricter rules on interment. Cemeteries were moved outside city walls to reduce contagion, and lime was used to cover bodies more swiftly. The dignity of the dead was still sought, but the urgency of survival reshaped long-held customs. The boundaries between reverence and necessity grew thin. Cleanliness, though poorly understood, began to gain new importance. Regulations forbade the dumping of waste in streets or rivers, and efforts were made to improve water supplies. In some towns, rudimentary sanitation systems were repaired or expanded, inspired by the memory of foul air during outbreaks. Though limited in scope, these steps reflected a growing awareness that environment shaped health, even if its true mechanisms remained hidden. The plague also encouraged record keeping. Cities began to track deaths, recording names and causes as best they could. Parish registers and civic rolls became tools not only of memory, but of surveillance, allowing authorities to gauge the spread of disease. In these lists lay the beginnings of statistical thought, a way of measuring human life that would guide decisions in centuries to come. Hospitals, once chiefly places of charity, were slowly redefined. Care for the sick poor was joined by efforts to contain contagion. Special wards were set aside for plague victims, and isolation became part of hospital design. Religious orders continued their service, but civic authorities took a stronger hand, blending faith with policy. In this mix, the hospital began its long journey toward modernity. Even architecture bore the mark of these changes. Lazarettos were often built on islands or at city margins, with walls and watchtowers to enforce separation. Their design reflected both fear and innovation, as containment became part of urban planning. These structures, born of desperation, became lasting fixtures, reminders of a world that could not afford to forget the lessons of calamity. The advances of this age were imperfect, yet they signaled a new way of thinking. Health was no longer seen solely as the concern of the soul or the family. It became a matter of the community, the city, the state. The Black Death, though it tore through Europe with cruelty, left behind the first fragile framework of public health, a legacy of vigilance carved from the memory of loss. The terror of the mid-14th century did not pass into memory with a single storm. After the Great Wave of 1347 to 1351, the pestilence returned again and again, striking generations that had thought the worst behind them. Each recurrence was less total, yet still cruel, robbing towns of children and grandchildren of those who had survived the first onslaught. Hope of permanence never lasted long, for the shadow of plague lingered at every turn of the century. In 1361 came the so-called pestilence of children, for it seemed to strike the young most severely. Families who had rebuilt their households after the first devastation watched in despair as sons and daughters withered, leaving heirs scarce once more. Chroniclers wrote of grief renewed, as if the wound of earlier years had been torn open afresh. Death had not finished its harvest. It simply returned with a different scythe. The 15th and 16th centuries knew the pestilence as a recurring guest. Outbreaks swept through London, Paris, and Florence at intervals, each one leaving scars upon the memory of the living. Bells tolled, trade halted, and processions filled streets once more. Though smaller than the first storm, these waves reminded all that plague was not a tale of the past, but a presence woven into daily life. Even as late as the 17th century, great cities were still humbled. The London outbreak of 1665, though centuries removed from the first arrival, echoed the same terrors: swollen buboes, hurried burials, and the desertion of the wealthy to country estates. The persistence of plague across 300 years etched it into the fabric of Europe. No generation was wholly free from its dread. The repetition forced societies to adapt. Quarantine systems became permanent features of port life, and civic authorities refined their measures with each return. Physicians grew more attentive, building upon the failures of their predecessors. The recurrence was cruel, but it also served as a teacher, driving progress in health and governance that might otherwise have slumbered. Culturally, the memory of recurrence deepened the obsession with mortality. Art, sermons, and songs rarely left the subject behind, for the threat never allowed them to. Even in times of prosperity, men carved skulls into their rings, painted dances of death on their walls, and spoke often of life's brevity. The plague's return ensured that Europe lived always with one eye fixed on the grave. Communities learned resilience, though it was a hard lesson. Villages prepared stores of food, cities developed burial plans, and rulers invested in measures of prevention. The presence of plague became almost seasonal, an unwelcome but expected part of life. Fear remained, but it was tempered with preparation, as experience slowly dulled the edge of panic. Thus, the Black Death was not a single wound, but a long illness stretching across centuries. Its first arrival shattered Europe, but its repeated returns shaped the very character of its people. To live in those times was to walk always with the knowledge that plague might rise again, a reminder that survival was never final, only temporary. The devastation of the plague, though it dimmed the light of countless lives, cleared a space for new growth. With fewer mouths to feed, resources stretched further, and survivors found opportunities their forebears had never known. Wealth concentrated in the hands of those left behind, and with it came the power to invest not only in survival, but in beauty, learning, and exploration. Out of sorrow's soil, the seeds of renewal began to rise. Italy, so deeply scarred, became the cradle of this renewal. Families like the Medici, enriched through banking and trade, poured their fortunes into art and architecture. Cathedrals were adorned with frescoes, and palaces rang with the voices of poets and scholars. Though born from grief, this patronage brought forth a flourishing of creativity that would come to define the Renaissance. The same cities that had once been emptied now pulsed with invention. Humanism, too, gained momentum from the plague's aftermath. The fragility of life pressed men to look not only to heaven, but also to the dignity of man on earth. Scholars revisited the texts of Greece and Rome, searching for wisdom in the ancients who had also faced decline and renewal. The emphasis shifted toward observation, critical thought, and the celebration of human capacity. Death had sharpened the desire to understand life. Universities, once shaken by loss, grew into centers of revived learning. In Padua, Paris, and Oxford, scholars examined medicine, law, and philosophy with renewed vigor. The failure of medieval remedies during the plague encouraged a willingness to question tradition. Slowly, inquiry replaced repetition, and knowledge expanded in directions long neglected. The very helplessness of the physicians in the 1340s gave rise to the scientists of the 15th century. Art bore the marks of this transformation. Painters began to depict not only saints and martyrs, but also landscapes, portraits, and scenes of daily life. The dance of death lingered, but alongside it came celebrations of beauty and form. Perspective, anatomy, and light became tools to honor the living as well as to mourn the dead. In brush and chisel, Europe expressed both its grief and its recovery. Literature echoed this dual spirit. Petrarch, mourning his losses, also turned to the wisdom of antiquity, shaping a language that bridged sorrow with hope. Writers across Europe grappled with the impermanence of life, yet their works carried a longing for renewal. Out of despair, a voice rose that affirmed the value of thought, memory, and creation. Words became the vessel by which Europe reimagined itself. Commerce fueled this spark as well. The wool and banking industries, transformed by the plague, generated wealth that financed voyages, scholarship, and monuments. Survivors, eager to leave their mark on a world made uncertain, invested in legacy. Town halls, libraries, and chapels rose from this impulse, each stone a testament to the determination to rebuild with meaning. The Black Death had thinned the ranks, but it also concentrated ambition. Thus, the Renaissance cannot be separated from the plague that preceded it. The great loss hollowed Europe, but in that hollow space, new light entered. What emerged was not a denial of mortality, but a response to it, an embrace of life, knowledge, and creation. Out of the silence of empty streets came the voices of artists and thinkers, whose echoes still reach us today. The centuries that followed the Great Pestilence were haunted by questions deeper than any sickness of the body. Thinkers wrestled with the meaning of a world where half of humanity could vanish in a season. Giovanni Boccaccio, though famed for his tales of wit, carried into his writings a sorrow that never left him. Petrarch lamented not only the loss of friends, but the fragility of civilization itself, seeing in the plague a mirror of life's transience. Their words gave voice to the unease of a whole generation. Philosophy turned inward, pondering the justice of God and the nature of fate. If the righteous and sinful alike perished, what order governed the universe? Theologians debated divine wrath and mercy with renewed intensity, their treatises reflecting both fear and hope. Some concluded that man could not comprehend the workings of providence, while others dared to suggest that human reason must share the search for truth. The silence of unanswered prayers demanded reflection. This spirit of questioning did not remain confined to theology. Scholars returned to the texts of antiquity, eager to compare the wisdom of the ancients with their own broken age. The works of Aristotle, Galen, and Hippocrates were re-examined with a sharper eye. Old authorities were not discarded outright, but their errors were more clearly recognized. The plague had revealed the dangers of blind trust in tradition. The rise of humanism was bound to this legacy. The focus on man's dignity, on the value of earthly life, grew stronger in an age that had seen life's brevity so starkly. Erasmus, writing in the following century, echoed this spirit, urging reform of both church and mind. The intellectual current shifted toward the belief that wisdom lay not only in faith, but in observation, language, and the cultivation of the self. Out of tragedy, a new confidence in human thought emerged. Literary forms also reflected the weight of remembrance. Morality plays staged in town squares reminded audiences of the inevitability of death, yet also encouraged virtuous living. Chronicles preserved stories not only of kings and wars, but of common suffering, giving memory to voices once ignored. The intellectual heritage of the plague was not abstract alone, it was written into the cultural habits of every village and city. Science advanced cautiously, yet its roots deepened. The helplessness of physicians before the pestilence stirred a greater insistence on empirical knowledge. Anatomical studies, astronomical charts, and experiments with remedies all reflected a hunger to know rather than simply to repeat. Though centuries would pass before true medicine arose, the impulse to challenge and to test was sharpened by the bitter lessons of failure. The image of death as an equalizer also shaped political thought. Writers reflected on how kings and peasants alike fell to the same fate, questioning the permanence of earthly hierarchies. Such reflections nurtured ideas of justice and equality, though still fragile and often suppressed. Yet the memory that no man, however mighty, could escape death lingered, whispering into the discourse of governance and morality. The intellectual legacy of the Black Death was not a single doctrine, but a transformation of spirit. Europe emerged sobered, questioning, and more willing to seek truth beyond inherited answers. The calamity etched into minds the urgency of understanding, the value of recording, and the necessity of doubt. From this soil of grief and inquiry, the Renaissance and Reformation would one day rise, carrying forward the lessons wrought in sorrow. By the dawn of the 15th century, Europe was no longer the same land that had entered the dark years of pestilence. The population had been thinned, yet the survivors carried with them new possibilities. Fields lay fallow, but wages rose. Churches still stood, but their authority had been questioned. Lords retained their titles, yet peasants had discovered bargaining power. The old world had not vanished entirely, but it had been bent, and from its bending came change. Feudalism, weakened by death and desertion, began its long decline. The bonds that tied men to their lords grew looser, replaced by contracts, wages, and migration. Across the countryside, peasants learned they could leave one master for another, or seize abandoned land as their own. The rigid chains of fealty gave way to a society where mobility was more possible, even if still contested. A structure that had endured for centuries began to crack open. Religious life, once unshaken, bore new fractures. The church still guided the souls of the faithful, but its failures during the plague left lingering doubts. Movements of reform would grow from these doubts, finding strength in the memory of unanswered prayers and absent priests. Faith remained, but it was reshaped, less certain, more searching, and open to new voices that would challenge authority. The ground for reformation was prepared in the silence of deserted churches. The economy too took on a different form. Trade routes adjusted, guilds reorganized, and wealth concentrated in fewer but stronger hands. Italian city-states turned catastrophe into advantage, laying foundations for Renaissance splendor. The wool trade expanded, banking rose in influence, and urban centers gained renewed power. Out of the ashes of collapse, a more dynamic and flexible economy began to stir, one that would carry Europe toward expansion and exploration. Cultural expression revealed both mourning and renewal. Painters, sculptors, and writers carried death into their works, but alongside it, they celebrated life with new intensity. The art of memento mori coexisted with the art of humanism. Songs of lament gave way to odes of beauty. The plague had forced men to confront mortality, but in doing so, it also awakened their hunger for creation, knowledge, and joy. Politically, monarchs rose while nobles waned. Central authority grew stronger as local power weakened, paving the way for nation-states. Armies shifted from feudal levies to professional soldiers, and governance leaned more on law than on custom. Europe's rulers, scarred by loss, began to build structures of power that could endure disruption. The seeds of modern states were sown in soil watered by grief. Even across centuries, the memory of the plague lingered. Outbreaks recurred, keeping fear alive, but also deepening preparation. Lazarettos, quarantine systems, and public health measures became permanent. The idea that communities bore responsibility for their collective safety had taken root. In this way, the plague's shadow stretched long into the future, shaping policy, culture, and imagination alike. Thus, the Black Death reshaped not only the 14th century, but the path of history itself. It was a storm that tore through families, villages, and kingdoms. But in its wake, it left a world altered beyond repair. From the silence of empty streets arose new economies, new states, new questions of faith, and a new vision of man. The pestilence was death's great harvest, yet from its aftermath grew the beginnings of the modern age.